Check 1, 2, 2, 2.
I reset the mic, but I reseated. Feels long. Testing, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Testing. Is it? Maybe Daryl. So what do you have it at, James? No. What do you have the mics or the room? Is the room at 2, -2?
Should I bring it to -2?
Yeah, I would go back at 2. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna be the witness.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Peter Piper 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Peter Piper 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Peter Piper 1, 2. Actually, I'm not hearing a hum, which is great. Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Did you hear that?
Are you hearing people?
A little. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right there, like towards the end. Your little ringing. This mic right here. It's just a little.
I don't know if that's an improvement, but.
Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think that's better. 1, 2.
Down 1 decibel, that's usually what I do. And then I had, when the house recording guy was in here, I had him kind of take a look a little bit closer, so.
Okay.
But if that continues to be a problem, I might switch it out.
Okay.
I have, earlier this morning, it seemed like, or yesterday, it was a little bit hot. So
Okay. Yeah.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Peter Piper 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Check. Check.
The Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. Good morning and welcome to today's full committee hearing. I thank our panel of witnesses and our committee members for joining today's discussion on the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act, Essa. Essa can be considered a milestone for K-12 policy because it was a monumental shift in the role states and school districts would have in the future of education. Essa sought to achieve two specific goals for K-12 education: autonomy and accountability. States and school districts were given new independence when creating a K-12 education program that works best for their own students, ending a Washington knows best approach to education. Additionally, Essa specifically prohibited the federal government from influencing states' adoption of particular standards. It also repealed federal mandates for teacher performance and protected a state's right to opt out of federal education programs. Part of Essa's goal for state and school district autonomy was to force Washington to remain at arm's length from states and school districts when it comes to education. And rest assured that this committee will be watching to ensure that Washington keeps its distance. While states and school districts were given more autonomy in Essa, the law maintains provisions ensuring parents have transparent information about school performance, and states and districts can hold schools accountable for delivering a high-quality education to all students. Essa also included unprecedented restrictions on the Department of Education's authority to take back the state and local flexibility guaranteed by the law. Essa has stripped away powers of the Department of Education, such as the ability of the Secretary of Education to legislate through executive fiat, or the ability of the department's bureaucrats to substitute their judgment for states. History made it clear that a top-down approach to K-12 education did not serve students, parents, teachers, or the states well, and Essa directly addressed these shortcomings. Given the monumental shift in education policy represented by Essa, it's important that we hear how implementation is progressing. We know the law will not fully take effect into the coming school year, and we will need time to assess its impact on schools and students. However, I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the progress state, school districts, and the Department of Education are making. This committee has been keeping a close eye on this implementation process. Last year, we held 4 hearings on implementation of Essa. Today, we'll continue our discussion on Essa's implementation. Essa was truly a change for K-12 education, and I do believe this bipartisan law delivers the proper balance of autonomy and accountability to parents and taxpayers while ensuring a limited federal role. This law has the ability to empower state and local leaders to change K-12 education for the better, and that is why it is of utmost importance to this committee. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and members during today's hearing. With that, I yield to Ranking Member Scott for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this morning's hearing on implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act. I'd like to thank our witnesses for appearing today, and I look forward to hearing their testimony. It is regrettable, however, Madam Chair, that we're not hearing from the U.S. Department of Education, particularly considering media reports of the majority's intention to critique its implementation of Essa during today's proceedings. I know I, for one, would greatly benefit from an open dialogue with the department on Essa implementation and for other matters. Chairwoman Fox, you'll remember that I sent you a letter urging Secretary DeVos and other agency heads to appear before the committee to discuss the administration's priorities. That request has not been fulfilled, so I'd like to take the opportunity again to ask Secretary DeVos or any other representative from the department who can discuss the administration priorities to appear to engage in an open dialogue with this committee. Now, Essa has been the law of the land for nearly 20 months. Now, while that may seem like a long time, in the life cycle of a law as consequential as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which passed over 50 years ago, it's really just the beginning. States are only now undergoing the peer review and planned approval process, followed by months of work amidst a regrettable, chaotic regulatory environment. As I said this in February and March, but it bears repeating, when Congress used the CRA to block the regulation of Title I's core requirements, that was unfortunate and counter to the bipartisan agreement in Essa, but this body did go forward with the CRA, and now that's the reality that we have to work with. That lack of regulation, however, means increased subjectivity in determining compliance with the law's requirements, which makes oversight actions of this committee even more important. This increased subjectivity without the clarifying regulations is apparent in the department's early feedback on state plans that were submitted in May during the May submission window. Some plan components were praised by peer reviewers in one state's plan, while the same components were questioned as insufficient in another. All the while, other violations of ESSA's equity requirements were overlooked by the department completely. Madam Chair, I'm disappointed that the media description of the reaction from some of our colleagues in the majority who have characterized the Education Department's state feedback plans as overreach. There's a difference between overreach and simply administering the program. We need to remember that ESSA was not a blank check to states and districts, and while the law afforded states and districts much flexibility, that flexibility must occur within the law, including guardrails concerning the assessments to ascertain persistent achievement gaps and accountability to close those achievement gaps. Congress designed the law's guardrails to protect the interests of the underserved students. And the law contained important requirements Republicans and Democrats all agreed to when we voted for ESSA, and those requirements must be meaningful. ESSA is not and never has been a free-for-all. It is the responsibility of the department, as articulated by Congress, to carefully scrutinize the quality of state plans and only approve those that meet the law's requirements. Even without regulations, the law is the law, and the law requires the Secretary to review the plans, ask hard questions, and if necessary, disapprove the plans in the interests of the students. And while, as I just mentioned, some of the content and overall inconsistency of the department's feedback may be problematic, none of us should take issue with the department attempting to do its job. Feedback must be more, not less consistent, and more, not less vigorous. And ultimately, the feedback and submission of plans must result in approval only of the plans that meet the spirit and the letter of the law. As we will hear today, many state plans leave much to be desired, either due to ambiguity or incompleteness in response, or due to plan components that violate the law's equity requirements. It's my hope that the department will work with states, including through provision of adequate guidance and technical assistance, to improve the overall quality of the state plans and ensure implementation that honors the long civil rights focus of the ESEA. Now, such implementation is only possible with the support and partnership of the federal government. It is not only the role of the department to support and monitor state efforts to comply with the law, but it's also the role of Congress to fund programs authorized by ESSA. Despite promises to implement the law as Congress intended, Secretary DeVos and President Trump proposed the elimination of bedrock ESEA programs like Title IIA to support teachers, 21st Century Learning Centers to support after-school programs, and cut to other programs, including an effective cut of nearly $600 million in Title I. Now, while the House majority fiscal year 18 labor rate appropriations bill isn't as draconian as the president's request, it fails to honor the bipartisan ESSA agreement by eliminating Title IIA, cutting after-school programs, and maintaining an effective cut to Title I that will be felt at the local level. Elimination of Title IIA would result in thousands of layoffs and inhibit local and state efforts to improve teacher, paraprofessional, and school leader supports. Defunding this program most certainly does not align with the bipartisan intent of the authorizing statute. Lastly, Trump Care's proposed cuts to Medicaid, if enacted, would devastate services for students with disabilities and undermine state and local efforts to educate all students to high standards as required by ESSA. And the situation would be even worse if the most recent repeal without a replace plan is enacted. Now, how effective can an implementation be without funding? I know all too often that state and local education agencies face capacity challenges, and I would hope to hear from today's witnesses about the negative impact of underfunding ESSA programs on faithful implementation. In closing, I remain concerned about many of the actions of Secretary DeVos and this administration concerning our nation's students. For example, the recent rhetoric from the Office of Civil Rights and the office's directive to ignore systemic data on when they investigate alleged civil rights violations, the lack of agency capacity to carry out key components of the department, including the absence of deputy secretaries, the rollback of protections for student borrowers, the rescinding of protections for transgender students, the sledgehammer-like approach to deregulation without transparency of decision-making of the department, and the decision to cancel the grant program to award $12 million to localities to provide technical assistance to help them desegregate their schools. All of these actions point to a troubling pattern that undermines the federal government's important role to protect and promote civil rights of all students. This pattern must not continue with ESSA implementation. I say that not out of wishful thinking or partisan spin, but because it's what is in the law that we enacted, and that needs to be enforced. Now, ESSA is clear. It is the responsibility of the department to review and provide feedback on ESSA state plans, make determinations of approvals or disapprovals based on compliance with the statute, and partner, including through enforcement activities, with states and school districts to support the law's implementation moving forward. It is the responsibility of states and districts to innovate within the guardrails of ESSA's equity requirements. That there may have been a change in administration, but the law is the law and the federal role is clear. I hope this committee commits to a robust oversight of ESSA implementation moving forward to ensure that it is responsibly fulfilled. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Pursuant to Committee Rules 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I now turn to introductions of our distinguished witnesses. Ms. Jacqueline Nowicki is the Director of K-12 Education for the U.S. Department of U.S. Government Accountability Office. Dr. Gail Pletnick is the Superintendent for the Dysart Unified School District in Surprise, Arizona. Mr. Philip Lovell is Vice President of Policy Development and Government Relations at the Alliance for Excellent Education. Dr. Carrie Wright is the Superintendent of Education for Mississippi. I now ask our witnesses to raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize each of you to provide your testimony, let me briefly explain our lighting system. We allow 5 minutes for each witness to provide testimony. When you begin, the light in front of you will turn green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow. At the 5-minute mark, the light will turn red, and you should wrap up your testimony. Members will each have 5 minutes to ask questions. I now recognize Ms. Nowicki for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss GAO's new report on early observations on state accountability systems under Aasa. As you well know, Aasa requires states to have accountability systems that meet certain requirements, but grants states flexibility in designing these systems. We focused our work on 4 areas of state accountability systems. 1, determining long-term goals. 2, developing performance indicators. 3, differentiating schools. And 4, identifying and assisting low performers. We did so because stakeholder groups identified these as key components of accountability systems under Aasa, and as areas in which states are making changes. My remarks today will focus on 2 key areas. First, I'll discuss stakeholder views on Aasa's flexibilities to redesign accountability systems. Second, I'll discuss next steps for the Department of Education in implementing Essa. In regards to my first point, all 9 national stakeholder groups with whom we spoke saw Essa's accountability provisions as somewhat flexible. For example, most of them praised the ability to define their own performance indicators. Most stakeholders also indicated that Essa strikes a good balance between flexibility and requirements. For example, one stakeholder said that Essa threads the needle very well between offering flexibility to design systems that meet state needs and requiring states to protect vulnerable populations. The extent to which states are changing their current systems varies. Some states are pleased with the systems they developed under their NCLB waivers and are continuing down that path. But for states that see their current systems as lacking in some way, or when stakeholder consultation highlighted the need for significant change, we were told that Essa provides room for states to consider innovative revisions. Our report provides many examples of how 2 states, Ohio and California, are tailoring their accountability systems of each of the 4 areas I mentioned. I'd like to highlight one example here. To address Essa's requirements to differentiate schools, Ohio plans to tweak its 6 current indicators to assess school and student performance. Some of these indicators would measure current performance, while others would measure growth. And schools would receive a letter grade on each indicator, as well as an overall letter grade. Ohio officials felt that this approach would provide detailed information on various elements of their performance system, as well as provide an easily understandable, high-level overview of performance. In California, the plan is to use a color-coded dashboard to differentiate school and student subgroup performance on each of 6 indicators. Each indicator will measure current performance as well as growth over time. Unlike Ohio, California does not plan to aggregate the indicators into an overall score. State officials said they chose not to aggregate because they feel that doing so can mask individual problem areas. They also told us that measuring current performance and growth for each indicator provides a more complete picture of performance. With regard to my second point, given current timelines, the Department of Education remains focused on providing assistance to states in developing their plans and on the review and approval process for plans. Moving forward, a key next step in Essa implementation is for the department to develop and implement state monitoring protocols. Although draft protocols were not available at the time of our review, education officials said that they plan to pilot protocols with 8 or 9 states in early 2018. The department's goal is to review all states within a 3 to 4 year cycle. Education officials also told us that they are considering whether there is a need for additional guidance for states. During our review, most national stakeholder groups told us that states could use guidance on a number of issues, such as how to identify and evaluate appropriate evidence-based interventions. In closing, I hope our early observations shine some light on how states are thinking about their accountability systems in the context of Essa's flexibilities. Essa implementation is still in the early days, and much work lies ahead for both states and the Department of Education before the promise of Essa can be fully realized. We look forward to working with you to support your efforts to oversee implementation of this important law. This completes my prepared remarks. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Nowicki. Dr. Pletnick, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Would you turn on your microphone, please?
Thank you. Chairman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to join you today. I am the superintendent of the Dysart School District in Arizona, and I also serve as president of AASA, the School Superintendent Association. I am here today because I believe it is critical we continue to work together to ensure the underserved populations in our schools truly benefit from the educational promise that the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, was designed to deliver. I thank you and the committee for convening this ESSA hearing. The House of Representatives and the Senate are to be applauded for the hard work that was done to craft ESSA, moving from the one-size-fits-all of No Child Left Behind to restoring control of education to the states and the local communities. Although ESSA may not be perfect, the power of the law is the flexibility it provides to states and schools, allowing the focus to be on the individual student. I have the opportunity to talk with superintendents from across the state of Arizona and across the nation about the progress made in ESSA implementation. A common thread in those conversations is that Essa has created an opportunity for stakeholders to become more involved in goal setting and establishing accountability processes as part of the consolidated plan requirement of Essa. Essa requires efforts to consult with and engage stakeholders when developing a consolidated state plan. In Arizona, committees and advisory groups were established to provide input at various stages of the plan development, feeding input into the process of building a final consolidated plan. I had the privilege of participating in some of these established subgroups, and I also attended public meetings designed to provide comment on proposed components in the plan. I am not going to tell you that Arizona has developed the ideal educational plan for our state. There is definitely room for continued improvement as we implement Essa, see what works, and continue to roll back state policies that lock in NCLB-era constraints. Stakeholders are engaged in conversation around the needs in our educational systems, a discussion that is important to driving the improvement necessary to provide an equitable, quality education to each student. A second promise of the Essa statute that many states are realizing is the ability to utilize multiple indicators for evaluation of our schools. In Arizona, we still rely heavily on annual summative tests, but the flexibility in Essa started a conversation about other meaningful measures that should be considered. Although not without faults, the revised accountability system in Arizona attempts to add indicators of significance, and that is something that we continue to look forward to improving. At the high school level, indicators incorporated include career and technical education assessments, advanced academic coursework indicators, and earned career credentials. The state's elementary level measures of accountability are far more restrictive, but conversation in the state of Arizona continues around exploring additional important measures. While we don't have it 100% right in Arizona just yet, I can say the flexibility in Essa around state accountability systems does encourage conversation among stakeholders about more accurate indicators of student and school success. There were challenges with the implementation of Essa Law. Time was definitely one of the biggest challenges. After the passage of the law, there was discussion related to the interpretation of the law and possible or proposed regulations, and that debate caused some hesitation. Arizona released its first draft and started the consolidated planning process in September of 2016, and the plan required adjustments before our submission for the September 2017 deadline. Another complication as it related to time is that some states, including Arizona, had laws in place better aligned to no child left behind mandates or waivers. With those state laws still in existence, there was an impact on what was required in our state plan and accountability system. Although that is not a federal concern, it does impact how innovative our state plans may be at this point. A great deal of time and effort went into Congress writing this piece of legislation and negotiating on those critical components that make Essa a good piece of educational legislation. The ultimate success of Essa lies in our implementation, yes, but also in federal appropriations. It is critical Congress match the bipartisan support demonstrated for the policy of the law and appropriate funding support. I respectfully submit that as we continue to work together to implement Essa and ensure it has the intended impact, that we be cognizant of the important complementary role of adequate federal investment. The students in our schools are our future leaders, our future workforce, and we must invest in our future by investing in public education. In closing, thank you to the committee for the work you have done and continue to do to ensure that the Every Student Succeed Act drives the change we all want to see in our schools. Equity in our classrooms regardless of a student's background, where they live, or the circumstances they live in. Your work has ensured our states and local communities have a voice in what happens in our districts and our schools. I know, given the opportunity, educational leaders across this country will use that voice to deliver on the promise of Essa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Pletnick. Mr. Lovell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act. My name is Philip Lovell, and I'm the Vice President for Policy Development and Government Relations at the Alliance for Excellent Education. We're a national nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring that every child graduates from high school ready for college, career, and citizenship. I have 4 core messages for you today. First, Essa is a civil rights law designed to ensure equity and excellence in education. Second, Essa preserves an important role for the U.S. Department of Education. Third, the quality of Essa state plans is uneven. And fourth, funding cuts threaten the implementation of the law. Let me begin with point 1. Essa is fundamentally a civil rights law with many federal requirements designed to promote educational equity and prepare students for post-secondary education in their workforce. Essa provides states with a significant level of flexibility when it comes to how they achieve equity and excellence, but Essa is not a blank check. Both states and the Department of Education must implement and enforce all of Essa's equity-focused requirements, a sample list of which appears in my written testimony. Second, when Congress enacted Essa, it preserved the limited but critical role of the Department of Education. While I may not agree with all of its findings, the department is appropriately carrying out its oversight role as required under the law. I want to be clear that this isn't about whether we trust states. I've worked with many state leaders, and I know that they're committed to kids, and one needs to look no further than my colleagues testifying today to know that that's the fact. The fact does remain, though, that it's the department's job to review the state plans and to ensure that they comply with the law that this committee wrote. These plans lay out a state's vision and commitment to children, parents, and the public, and they'll impact students and teachers for at least the next decade. We have to get this right, and the department has a critical and statutorily required role to play. Third, the quality of Essa state plans is uneven. There are certainly some strengths, but there are missed opportunities and many weaknesses, including some proposals that simply violate the law. In particular, many plans fall short of the equity promise of Essa, and let me give you a few examples. Essa made a commitment that if a school has a single subgroup that consistently underperforms, be they African American students, Latino students, the school would be identified for targeted support, and those kids would receive help. Essa applies this requirement to each individual subgroup separately because groups of students perform differently, and if you combine them together, you can mask the low performance of a single group. Unfortunately, this is exactly what some states are doing. One state combines the achievement levels of African American, Latino, and Native students together, even though this creates a risk that that schools may not be identified for support when they should be. It also violates the law. A related but distinct problem is that states are not including historically underserved kids in their school ratings. For example, a school might receive an A despite the fact that African American students or Latino students or students with disabilities or low-income kids, other historically underserved groups, might have, say, a low graduation rate. So you can receive an A even though, say, African American kids could have a graduation rate of 60%. Another problem for equity in Essa plans relates to the identification of subgroups for support. Several states have proposed identifying subgroups for support if they aren't on grade level in math or reading, or if they have a low graduation rate, and this makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, the department has actually pushed back on this approach. Students shouldn't have to fail on everything before they're identified for support. In addition, it's worth noting that while Essa's flexibility was intended to unleash creativity and innovation, by and large, this hasn't happened. We hope to see policies that would promote critical thinking and problem solving, sometimes called deeper learning. And although there are a few notable exceptions described in my written testimony, and here to my left, I would say, state plans thus far are cautious, not courageous. Finally, I join my colleagues in expressing concerns about funding. Money is not magic, but I'm concerned about the impact of funding cuts on Essa. Essa provides states with flexibility and responsibility. But Madam Chair, responsibility without resources will not yield results. By freezing funding for Title I, underfunding Title IV, proposing to eliminate or reduce funding for professional development, literacy, after-school programs, on top of proposed cuts to Medicaid that jeopardize the services that schools provide to our most vulnerable kids, we're handcuffing states at the exact moment that we've supposedly given them freedom. This is unfortunate because the nation is on an upswing in education. Graduation rates are at an all-time high, including graduation rates for students who have been historically underserved. By implementing and enforcing ESSA's requirements and strengthening our investment in education, we can ensure that every child in America succeeds. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lovell. Dr. Wright, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Before I want to start, I wanted to introduce some people that are key to the implementation of this back in my state. I have my state board chair, Ms. Rosemary Altman, with me, the vice chair, Dr. Jason Dean, and one of my chiefs who's responsible for legislation and communication who are here with me today. So thank you. Chairman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about Mississippi's work to implement the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. I look forward to sharing my perspective as the State Superintendent of Education for Mississippi, and I am also President-elect of the Board of Directors for the Council of Chief State School Officers. ESSA has given Mississippi the opportunity to create a plan specifically designed for the students of our state. At the same time, the law provides guardrails to ensure our work is appropriately targeted toward improving educational opportunities and outcomes for all students and all schools. Our plan is called Mississippi Succeeds, and we are proud that it builds upon our state board's strong strategic plan to prepare students for college and careers. This strong foundation includes a rigorous academic standards for all students, aligned assessments to track student achievement, and an accountability model that clearly measures the performance of our schools and our districts. Our ESSA plan also builds upon the significant investments that Mississippi has made in early childhood education, literacy, career and technical education, advanced coursework opportunities for students, and professional development for all teachers. All of these initiatives have broad stakeholder support and have resulted in improved student outcomes. To design Mississippi Succeeds, we again sought broad input from stakeholders over an 18-month period to craft a plan tailored to the needs of our students. During those 18 months, we conducted a listening tour, which included 15 public meetings throughout the state. We hosted targeted meetings with specific stakeholder groups and collected feedback through an online survey. Among our most active participants were advocates for the underserved, majority African American communities in rural, low-income areas of the state, parents of students with disabilities, and teachers of English language learners. Mississippi has a small but growing population of English learners, and most of the teachers of the English learners who participated in our feedback sessions were the only people in their schools whose work was dedicated to English learners. Throughout these meetings and the online survey, we gathered 7,300 feedback points. We established working groups, and we established an ESSA advisory committee made up of stakeholders to provide us feedback and input throughout the entire development of our plan. We intend to keep all of our partners engaged in our implementation of the plan through regular meetings with our stakeholders as well as with the ESSA Advisory Committee. The robust participation of stakeholders helped Mississippi develop a strong plan to meet the requirements of ESSA, and I'm especially excited about the following aspects of our plan: providing effective teachers with the opportunities to not only teach children, but to work collaboratively to lead colleagues to improve their practice. Expanding early childhood to support early childhood educators in a variety of pre-K settings to implement developmentally appropriate practices in their classrooms. Improving schools by investing in the local teachers and administrators, supporting communities through P16 councils, strengthening parent engagement through school-based activities. We appreciate the flexibility of ESSA because we intend to include subgroup performance to identify schools for school improvement support. This will have the greatest impact on African American students who make up our state's largest underperforming subgroup. We're expanding career and technical education to provide continuous computer science education in grades K through 12, and to provide our high school students with the opportunity to graduate with a career and technical diploma endorsement that is of equal value to an academic endorsement. We are putting a strong focus on eliminating the proficiency gap between African Americans and all students entirely so that the proficiency rates for all of our subgroups will increase to 70% by 2025. All of these initiatives are dependent on federal support for public education. As a state chief, I understand that federal resources are limited and that states must be effective stewards of tax dollars. Mississippi's ESSA plan is built around the targeted and efficient use of federal funds to maximize the impact on student achievement, especially of our most disadvantaged students. I want to thank you for the flexibility that you've provided through the Every Student Succeeds Act. And as you can see, our Mississippi Succeeds will expand the state's education reform efforts to improve opportunities and outcomes for all students. Mississippi's future will be shaped by the students of today, and we're deeply committed to equipping them to learn, build, create, serve, and innovate. We believe in the capacity of our students to achieve, and we believe in the ability of our teachers and schools to guide them to a successful future. ESSA is at the heart of our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Thanks again to all of our witnesses. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Virginia Fox, for your extraordinary leadership providing for this hearing today, and I want to thank each of you for being here today. I especially appreciate your service because I'm the very happy husband of a dedicated teacher, and I want to keep her happy too, so thank you for what you're doing. And Dr. Wright, South Carolina students greatly benefit from career and technical education with partnerships with companies such as BMW, MTU, Michelin, and Boeing in the South Carolina technical education system. South Carolina has been very fortunate with the vision of technical education being promoted under the leadership of State Superintendents of Education from Dr. Barbara Nielsen to today with the Honorable Molly Spearman. In your testimony, you include several aspects of your state's plans to meet the requirements of the Every Student Succeeds Act, including, and you cited, the efforts of career and technical education. Can you elaborate your promotion of career and technical education for the citizens of Mississippi?
Yes, sir, I will. About 65% of the jobs that are currently available in our state are requiring middle skills. And so we have formed a committee that is working not only with our State Workforce Investment Board, but also on the implementation of the Workforce Investment Act. We have 4 sectors in our state, and what we have done is we have established groups in each of those sectors to work directly with the businesses in those sectors so that we can then come back and design CTE plans that will allow our children to go starting in high school, graduate from high school, and go immediately into the workforce. Our state needs that immediate piece, and that's what we've got planned as well.
And what a meaningful and fulfilling life you help young people achieve, so thank you for what you do. And Dr. Pletnick, I want to thank you for your testimony on a very important issue, and that is local elected school boards. And I know that my view is that they work best for our students. I learned this firsthand. My dad was a school board member in Charleston. I served in the state senate working with school boards and found out the extraordinary diversity within a single district that the school boards have to address, and the hard work, but the extraordinary dedication of school board members. Your testimony promotes, again, moving from one size fit all. Can you provide more detail on how the Every Student Succeeds Act will help restore local control of education and allow educators to address the unique needs of individual students?
Member Wilson, thank you for that question. In the Dysart Unified School District, we utilize a strategic planning process. So our community gives us that feedback. We work with our business partners. We work with our parents to ensure that we are meeting the needs of our students in our local community. And our school board is that connection. So they are the elected officials. The Essa has allowed us then to work through our state to ensure that the multiple measures that we are utilizing speak to those needs of our students, certainly our underserved population, but really for all students, making certain that they're future ready. We too have a very strong career and technical education program because we hear from our local community and from our business partners that there are opportunities. We have Luke Air Force Base in our backyard. We recently took a tour, and it takes 2 billion lines of code to run the F-35. They have that mission. And so we're ensuring that our students have opportunities with coding and other pieces. That is something that is a strong piece in our strategic plan as we move forward. And so again, ESSA provides us that opportunity to look at multiple indicators and those that would truly serve our underserved population, but all of our students as well.
And thank you for, again, looking out for all students. As I served in the State Senate, now Congress, I represent a district, Lexington #1. the diversity there. You have resort areas, you have very upscale subdivisions, you have normal middle-class subdivisions, you have a small town, you have rural communities, and then you have agricultural communities. That's in one district. And so the local school board is just so important. And Ms. Nowicki, I want to thank you for your service and your promotion of flexibility. Can you explain how flexibility of the Act would provide for a different approach in adopting performance indicators?
Sorry, sir. You're asking how the flexibility of the Act could...
Assist with performance indicators in determining performance indicators.
So there were a couple of different examples in our report where states were making different decisions, I think, around performance indicators, the way they defined subgroups, how they were choosing to use summative or overall ratings versus individual ratings on indicators. I think it provides flexibility for states to do whatever they think makes sense for them in their local context, while providing sufficient guardrails to protect vulnerable populations and subgroups.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Courtney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this really important hearing. But I want to join the ranking member in saying how I think a lot of us feel frustration about the fact that the Secretary of Education has not yet appeared before this committee. It's been 6 months into this administration. We've had a budget out since May, and looking historically, we have always had the Secretary of Education appear before this committee to take questions from members about issues of the day. And clearly what we're talking about today, for all of us listening to our commissioners back home, stakeholders who've been working hard on implementation of ESSA. There is a lot of confusion out there, and we need people from the department, particularly the person who's in charge, where the buck stops, to answer questions about where are we going. The ESSA was signed into law on December 10th, 2015. It was actually a really inspiring tableau to see President Obama signing that law with Senator Lamar Alexander, Republican leader in the Senate. Mr. Rokita from our committee was standing behind the president. Again, it was a lot of hard work that went into that to, again, achieve some of the goals that some of the witnesses have talked here today. But fast forward, and it's really not that early in the implementation of the law to where we are today in 2017. There's a lot of confusion out there about just the mixed messages and signals that are coming out of the department as states are working hard to try and, again, achieve the goals of this legislation. It has not been helped, by the way, by the fact that the Republican majority chainsawed out of the federal law, the regulations back in May with the Congressional Review Act enactment that President Trump signed into law that, again, just completely eliminated the roadmap that had been put into place by the department. Again, I had questions about some of those regs, but the fact is now we have a black hole in the federal law in terms of how ESSA is structured and designed. And when you talk about confusion out there, frankly, the majority added to that confusion by, in my opinion, just indiscriminately butchering the regs that were in place. And so that's where we are today. Again, my state of Connecticut did everything right, I think, in terms of pulling together stakeholders. They worked very diligently in terms of coming up with a plan which was submitted. Again, it got kicked back about a month or so ago. Talking to the folks in that department, they want to work collaboratively, but frankly there is tremendous confusion about which direction they're supposed to go in, and frankly, again, it's just another reason why the Secretary should be here today answering questions to all of us about where she in fact intends to take this department. We know when there's confusion in Washington, going back to the infamous words of Deep Throat during the Watergate scandal, follow the money. Again, Mr. Lovell, I'd like to just sort of follow up on your comments. We obviously have seen a budget come out of this administration in terms of their priorities as far as Title I, Title II, after school. Again, one of the goals of ESSA was to move away from the punitive approach of No Child Left Behind and to try and help districts who had been identified as underperforming. And again, I just would ask you to comment further about cutting these programs, in fact, removes the resources that ESSA was built around in terms of trying to help school districts that are struggling.
No, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. In fact, it's interesting. So one of the issues that came up just a few minutes ago, Mr. Wilson, you brought up career and technical education. And I think that's a huge opportunity within this law. And first, let me applaud the committee for its work on the reauthorization of the Perkins Law. Unfortunately, because of the levels of funding that are being proposed for things like career and technical education and the cuts therein, we're not able to implement a lot of those programs. Right now, with states having the ability to design their plans and implement them, the integration of rigorous academics with CTE is a major opportunity. There's language specifically in the law that you wrote within Title I that allows states to do this. And not only that, you allowed states to use up to 3% of their funding for direct student services. And one of the uses of the direct student services funding that you allowed was the provision of CTE that leads to an industry-recognized credential. Very few states are planning to use this 3% set aside for direct student services. And why? Well, it's because they feel like it cuts into their Title I budget. So by level funding Title I, by cutting elsewhere, that means the Title I dollars are going to have to go towards other things, and it means that states don't have the ability to really carry out the vision of the law that this committee set.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to the panel being here. And I would concur with Mr. Courtney as well that it'd be a great opportunity and time when we have a chance to hear from our Secretary of Education. I believe my colleagues will be impressed with her as much as I'm impressed with her abilities. And yet we also hope that there's a stopping of the stonewalling and blocking of confirmations that would assist her with people who can be undersecretaries, assistants, et cetera, to help in the process of moving forward with something she has identified Essa, something she wants to implement as intended, as we intended fully. So I look forward to that as well. But today we have these witnesses here, and Ms. Nowicki, thank you for being here. In your testimony, you mentioned that the department is considering additional areas of guidance that might be needed for states as they implement Essa. Has the department said what those areas might be, and how will they determine if that additional guidance is in fact needed?
Yes, sir. The department has said that they are conducting a review of all of their current guidance that's available and looking for gaps or areas where states might need additional assistance. They have various ways to do that. They've mentioned webinars that they hold and meetings that provide a forum for states to share some concerns or some areas where they may need guidance. In our work, stakeholders who are working directly with states developing their plans mentioned a couple of areas as well.
If you could highlight some of those.
Surely. One is how to select evidence-based strategies and measure their efficacy in the states. It's not unusual throughout government and in the states for there to be a lack of capacity in terms of knowing how to evaluate strategies. So that was one area. A second area was noting that because ESSA provides much more funding flexibility than did NCLB, helping states understand the broad funding flexibilities that they do have available to them in the law would be useful for states.
And those flexibilities are, just name a few of those.
Funding flexibilities to combine funding streams under the law in ways that they were not able to do under NCLB.
With local, state,
yes, different federal, state, local funds together.
Okay. Ms. Nowicki, this is obviously an initial look at early implementation of ESSA. But do you believe there's future work GAO could do on this topic as states put the law into practice over the next few years?
Absolutely. I think in the shorter run, two areas may be important. One, I think it'll be important to pay attention to how education's monitoring protocols are shaping up. Essa obviously encourages a much more state-driven approach in developing their plans, and we would want to see monitoring protocols reflect that, yet developing them in a way that also holds state accountable for federal requirements may take some doing. Two, I think it will be important to look at how states are making the public aware of differences in school and district performance in their states, and whether key stakeholders find that information useful. We like to say at GAO that data is only useful if it's used, and that usefulness is in the eye of the beholder. So if stakeholders and parents are not able to access the information or don't find that it's telling them things that they would like to know, I think it would be important to know that.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and Madam Chairwoman, I appreciate the fact as we heard that testimony, we talked more about stakeholders at the local and state level as opposed to federal, and that's a good thing. Dr. Pletnick, thank you for being here. Essa returns a significant authority to school districts to determine how to intervene in and how to improve low-performing schools, which is important to consider if we're expecting education to reach the masses of our country. What initiatives are in place in your district, or are you working to implement, that will do just that?
Member Waldberg, we have put in place a number of initiatives. First of all, when we are looking at each of our schools, we take a proactive approach rather than reactive approach. So we make sure that the programs that we have in place are providing that high quality education. We use an RTI process in which we have tiered interventions. So tier one is that classroom. We need high quality teachers delivering high quality instruction. And then if we do have our struggling students, especially in our underserved populations, we need to evaluate what it is their specific needs are. Again, I believe Essa versus No Child Left Behind allows us to focus on that individual student, not just the aggregate. So we provide those interventions, sometimes through interventionists. We have online programs because we really want access 24/7 for our students in order to provide the supports they need. And again, the intensity of those interventions continues to grow as we work with the individual student to fill those needs. The other thing that we are doing across the district is personalized learning. So we are looking at what the students' strengths are, certainly their area of challenges, but also their interests, because we need to engage our students in their learning. We need them to own their own learning. So we are working on ways to really not only have them own that learning, understand about progress, but also ways that we could use space and place and
Dr.
pace
Pletnick,
differently.
I'm going to have to ask you to wind up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Polis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott, for holding this important education hearing. You know, when I first ran for Congress several years ago, one of the main reasons I ran was to fix our outdated education policy, No Child Left Behind, during my time on the State Board of Education in Colorado. And as a school superintendent, I saw a lot of the flaws of No Child Left Behind firsthand. And I was thrilled to work on the Every Student Succeeds Act in this committee, in the conference committee. A number of bills that I wrote were incorporated into that bill. And I was very excited by a step forward that I think everybody felt was better than its predecessor. Now, I'm troubled now by some of the comments I've heard from my Republican colleagues who seem to be suggesting that since we passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, states can somehow do whatever they want. The goal of the Every Student Succeeds Act was to maintain, of course, our civil rights, guardrails, and safeguards. In effect, to provide school districts and states the flexibility to do what works, but not the flexibility to fail and to do nothing. No one here voted to let states and school districts fail when we passed the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we shouldn't be surprised. The Department of Education is providing meaningful and positive feedback to the states that helps them develop and implement their ESSA plans, and that they'll only approve plans that meet the law's requirements. That was the requirements that we, as a body, overwhelmingly voted to include in the actual law. Dr. Pletnick, I wanted to thank you for being here today. Really, one of the ironies that I see is while the Department of Education is trying to do a good job providing feedback to states, at the same time, both by the president's budget and the congressional Republicans, they're slashing funding for some of the key programs. And I want to highlight one in particular. Colorado, like many other states, went through an extensive stakeholder engagement process to develop Title II as part of our state plan for teacher and professional development. Last week, House Republicans moved forward with a budget that eliminates funding for Title II Part A, the real significant funding stream for teacher professional development and classroom size reduction. How can states deal with this uncertainty around the use of funds for teacher and professional development and classroom size reduction that are already included in their plans if the funding goes away?
Thank you for that question. That is a problem. When there are funding cuts, that means either the elimination or cutting back on programs, and many of these are critical. I can tell you in the state of Arizona, for Title II, the impact would be about $16.9 million in professional development. That's supporting more than 34,000 educators. Class size reduction would be impacted, and that would impact about 137 positions that we have. And statewide, the impact of the total Title II elimination would be about $32.5 million. So it would have a devastating impact in those areas.
And given that those education plans included the use of that money for teacher training and classroom reduction, does that mean that'll send and affect states back to the drawing board for their Title II plans and their teacher training plans?
I think that would be correct, because our budgets are very tight, and so again, when we have an elimination of funding, that means you have to go back and look at your programs, and quite frankly, all of the programs that we have in our own district, I can say, are essential, including those that we provide for professional development.
Next, for Mr. Lovell, I wanted to ask, one area where we also made progress in the Every Student Succeeds Act is early learning, the most important, the studies show, investment in early childhood education. We authorized a new preschool development grant program. The law will hopefully facilitate better collaboration between early learning and K-12. Can you talk about how states so far are taking advantage of new opportunities to support early learning under ESSA, and what lessons we can learn from some of the states that have submitted their early learning components to their plan?
Thank you, Mr. Polis. Well, really the answer to that question goes back to your first question, which is that plans that might be in place or ideas that we might have are going to be severely undercut if there's no resources to fund them. And so you have cuts that are being proposed both by the administration, by the House Labor H Committee, you've got cuts being pondered for Medicaid. You put all that together, and it's hard for states to really envision something robust and necessary and costly like a robust early childhood program.
Yeah, and I think to clarify what you're saying, when our committee writes the authorizing legislation, the Every Student Succeeds Act, it's only as good as the funding that actually funds those programs that we authorize. Dr. Wright, can you briefly share more about what Mississippi is doing in early learning?
Absolutely, and thank you for that. We passed a law establishing early learning collaboratives. That was the first time that we went into that foray. We are also looking and monitoring the results of that. With our kindergarten assessment, we realized that 2/3 of our children that were entering kindergarten were not prepared. So we knew that there was a need for pre-K. And so now we are also reaching out to all of the pre-K, public or private, in order to provide them with professional development. We do that free of charge to anyone that touches 3 or 4-year-olds in our state. And we honestly believe that it is a lever that is going to make a difference in the state of Mississippi. So we have a lot of interest in that and a lot of infrastructure that we're putting toward that.
I thank the gentlelady, and just in brief closing, I'll just inquire of the chair if we have invited or plan to invite Secretary DeVos for an oversight hearing before our committee as well, and I'll yield back with that inquiry.
The gentleman yields back. We do plan to invite her. Mr. Guthrie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for yielding. I appreciate the time. And this question is actually is based on the testimony from Dr. Wright, but Dr. Pletnick, I'd like for you to answer this as well, but it's based on Dr. Wright's testimony. It'd be applicable, I'm sure. It says, in Kentucky, Education Commissioner Stephen Pruitt in the Kentucky Department of Education found similar successes in hosting town halls across the state, engaging partner organizations and accepting public comment in order to craft a new assessment and accountability system. When it was all said and done, the department received an input of 6,000 Kentuckians on the matter. Based on the feedback you received in your town halls, what were the biggest changes stakeholders wanted to see reflected in your state plan?
They wanted to see more communication between schools and districts. They also were interested in not necessarily defining teacher effectiveness by years of experience and licensure, but by linking it more to student outcomes, and that we heard loud and clear. They really viewed an effective teacher as one that produced positive outcomes in children. And so those are two key pieces, if you will. There were several, but those were two that we take to heart. We are already in the process of designing resources that we have continued to push out to our districts and our schools to help them better engage with parents at the local level. And also we're revising our whole teacher evaluation system to really look at it as more of a professional growth system and driving that around linking it to our student outcomes, which is what we are hearing from our constituents.
Okay, Dr. Plotnick, did you have similar experiences?
We did, and there was a great deal of discussion around those multiple indicators and really redefining ready, what future ready means. So there was discussion about the Career and College Index. There was discussion about what are those other significant and meaningful indicators that would keep us transparent, help our parents, our community understand the accountability system and what student success looks like.
Okay, what kind of examples of indicators did you?
So in the end, as I had mentioned earlier, we do have college and career indicators. We do also have indicators around other national assessments that are utilized as kind of opening or gatekeepers into higher education. We do have advanced coursework as well. So there really is a very long list of indicators that are now considered as part of our accountability.
How are you once this is all implemented and moving forward, planning or like additional town halls to try to continue to seek feedback for continuous improvement, or what kind of methods are you going to try to still have stakeholder feedback? Continue what you're doing?
I would hope that at our state level, with our State Department, and there's no reason to believe that won't be the case, that we will continue to look at what's in place, analyze the data we're collecting, and see how we can refine and improve moving forward.
And that's exactly what Mississippi is planning on doing. We want to stay engaged with our stakeholders. They've invested a lot of time and energy in this. I've also got a very large ESSA advisory council that I intend to keep on board with a very diverse group of folks. So we've got to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our constituents, and those are two very strong ways that we can do that.
Thank you very much. And I have one for Ms. Nowicki. I've heard concerns from the Kentucky Department of Education that the department has provided that your department here, the federal department, has provided inconsistent feedback to states that submitted plans early when compared one to another. Is this something the GAO has found to be true? And if so, what is the department doing to provide consistent guidance?
Yes, sir. So GAO, as you know, does not have a statutory or other role in reviewing state plans. At the time that we did our work, there were only a couple of plans that had been submitted in draft for feedback, so we did not have any information from the department about feedback on the plans at the time we did our work.
You haven't covered, well, okay, so you did your study before you would have been able to see where there was inconsistent
Yes, sir.
feedback. One plan gets one and one plan gets another. That's something that we hopefully will be able to look into as we move forward.
I mean, if I may, I can
Yeah.
provide some thoughts on this. I mean, I think that there definitely were areas where feedback was inconsistent. I think part of it has to do with the fact that without the regulations, there are fewer specific rules around some of the vague areas in the law. So one area where, and a question came up earlier around areas that the department could provide future guidance in. I think one area, as Dr. Plotnick was describing, the various indicators that can be selected. This is an area where the law gives states flexibility and even provides some examples of the indicators that states can use. A number of states are interested in really prioritizing college and career readiness. So they're including things like access and performance in advanced placement, international baccalaureate, dual enrollment, early college. Feedback to one state was somewhat negative about the state's approach to this, and we're fearful that feedback like that, without additional guidance as to how those things can be included in the accountability system, could put the freeze on state innovation and doing what we all want want states to be doing. After all, the law specifically says that states can include access and performance on advanced coursework, and then when a state tried to do it, they got a little pushback from the department. So I
Mr.
think that's
Lovell.
an area where you could have some additional
Mr.
guidance.
Lovell,
Thank you,
I'm
that
gonna-
was helpful. My time's expired, and I'll yield back. Thank you for those comments.
Yes, sir. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott, for holding this important hearing about the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act. I want to also join my colleagues who expressed their opinion, and I agree that it would be very helpful to hear from the Secretary and the Department as we're talking about implementation. I worked on education issues in my home state of Oregon at the local level and then in the state legislature. And it quickly became clear that the real work needed to be done at the federal level. And so at the top of my legislative agenda list when I joined Congress was rewriting No Child Left Behind. And I was thrilled to serve on the committee when we worked on Every Student Succeeds Act and on the conference committee and be there at the bill signing. And it was a great day and was looking forward to implementation. So needless to say, I was disappointed earlier in the year when the majority, instead of talking about which regulations were problematic and which they could support, instead got rid of all of them through the Congressional Review Act and blocked important regulations related to statewide accountability systems, consolidated plans, and data reporting. And then at the same time, the new administration, left without their implementing regulations, attempted to rush through revised guidance for peer reviewers. Then there was a modified template for state plans and new explanatory documents, and all of this was taking place less than a month before the initial deadline for submitting the plans, and after many states were well on their way to completing their plans. So I don't think we should be surprised that there has been uncertainty and confusion. Disappointed, yes, but not surprised. And in fact, without the Essa regulations, now there's a conversation about which NCLB regulations are still in effect and what do we do about those. So what we really need is for the department to play a reliable role in enforcing compliance with the statutory requirements in the law and clearing up areas of ambiguity and helping states take advantage of the flexibility that's such an important part of the law. And I know in my home state of Oregon, I had conversations as they were working on their plan about the lack of certainty. And they appreciate the flexibility, but don't want to go down a path and then months later be told that you can't go down that path. So, Mr. Lovell, in the department's feedback letter to my state of Oregon, the department noted that Oregon's plan proposed to include, in the Students with Disabilities subgroup, students who had previously been identified as students with disabilities but had exited that status recently. The department said Oregon cannot use that flexibility, even though it was permitted in the accountability regulations that were finalized when they were writing their plan. So can you describe other instances where states actually lost flexibility because of Congress's action to block important implementing regulations?
Sure. So one area where we lost flexibility, my apologies. So one area where we lost flexibility is in the ability of states to provide credit to their schools where kids are performing above proficiency. Right. So we would like to be able to really prioritize higher order thinking skills, and one way that you could do that is by providing credit for students that are performing above proficiency. The law very specifically says that kids should be that the academic achievement indicator needs to measure proficiency. So it's questionable as to whether you can actually provide credit for students that are performing above proficient. As a result, you have some states, one in particular that I can think of, where they're not measuring proficiency at all, which is also not consistent with the law.
Right.
So I totally agree with you. The removal of the regulation on top of a new template less than 30 days before the applications were due did cause a decent amount of confusion, and I think that that had the regulation been in place, we wouldn't see some of the inconsistencies that we're seeing.
Thank you. And I also want to follow up. We've heard a lot of talk about the importance of stakeholder engagement, and that was a really critical component of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Mr. Lovell, the department's revised template does not include explicit questions about stakeholder engagement, as well as other important requirements of ESSA, including provisions related to homeless and foster youth. And I know you've reviewed the state plans, and how has the department's decision to exclude those statutory requirements affected the development of state plans? And based on your review of state plans, are states actually meeting these requirements of the Every Student Succeeds Act?
So thank you very much for that question. If it's not written, you don't know whether it's happening or not. And so I agree that, that especially around some of our most vulnerable kids, our homeless students and our kids in foster care, not having specific questions for those students means that we don't know what is going to be happening. That said, just because it's not in the template doesn't mean that those requirements don't exist.
Right.
So it's very important that we still carry out and oversee the implementation of those provisions, even if the questions were not asked in the template.
Thank you. More need for certainty. And Madam Chairwoman, as I yield back, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge my senior legislative assistant, Adrian Anderson, who has worked with me for several years on this committee, on the Every Student Succeeds Act especially, and he is leaving at the end of the month to go to law school, and I just want to thank him.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Mr. Barletta, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Pletnick, thank you for your testimony and for being here today. There are studies showing that poor attendance can impact academic achievement, ultimately leading to lower reading and math scores. We know that chronic absenteeism negatively affects student success, and this has led to some states to propose absenteeism as an additional accountability measure in their Essa plans. We also know there is evidence that quality after-school and summer learning programs are cost-effective strategies in increasing student attendance at all grade levels. I've seen this firsthand through an after-school organization in my district, the SHINE program. SHINE focuses on project-based learning with an emphasis on a STEM curriculum. It gets kids excited about learning again. And it's proven to work. 92% of SHINE students had exceptionally good or satisfactory school attendance. 97% of students indicated they were excited about STEM, and the number of students who said they would like to study math or science in college increased by 14%. The numbers speak for themselves. When students are excited about learning, they show up for class and feel personally invested in their education, setting themselves up for success down the road. Can you speak to how state Essa plans may be encouraging school districts to leverage Title I and Title IV funds to provide after-school and summer learning opportunities to their students? And how can districts partner with community-based organizations to address problems like chronic absenteeism?
Thank you for that question, and in fact, in Arizona, that was one of the indicators that we wanted to include, because we do see some of those same results that you have, and I can speak to my own district, but also neighboring districts. With our underserved populations especially, having those after-school opportunities serve many purposes, but certainly engage students in their learning. And we, too, have opportunities to have coding, to have STEM, those really critical skills that students enjoy being a part of. What we have also seen is through those programs, we have increased parent involvement because they are able to engage with their students in those activities. So truly, by using our funding, Title I, Title IV, those types of programs, we believe are having a positive impact academically on our underserved populations.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barletta. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Pletnick, well, first of all, congratulations on being named President-elect of the AASA. Given the fact that you must be familiar with that organization's position on the ESSA regulations rolled back under the CRA in February, I was hoping you'd be able to explain the reversal of AASA's position. When the final regulations regarding accountability were released, your organization endorsed them, recognizing that your three major concerns were addressed. Then in February, when they were up for discussion and rollback, your organization supported the CRA. What changed between November and February, and why this dramatic turnaround?
Again, as an organization, we truly support what is in the best interest of all of our schools. And certainly, when the regulations, I had an opportunity, in fact, to testify in front of a Senate committee about those regulations. And again, although there were some changes that were made in terms of those, we did not feel that indeed, as a package, there weren't some issues or concerns with those. So I think AASA's position was about making certain that we have the most flexibility and autonomy as we move forward in order to implement Essa in terms of the spirit of the law.
But, Ms. Plotnick, I still don't understand why the change. I mean, you spoke in very general terms. What was there any? What explains this reversal of position? You supported the regulations when they were first promulgated, and then suddenly your organization turns around and does a reversal. They support the Congressional Review Act overturning of those regulations. I mean, in my mind, the regulations allowed for the implementation of ESSA. What is, I mean, I don't have a sense you explained really gave an adequate explanation.
I apologize for not being clear. Again, I am speaking in broader terms in terms of when you look at...
is there one specific? Can you, one or two specifics you can name?
Again, I would ask that I be allowed to provide that opportunity for the record, going back to ASA in order to provide that.
That's fine. That's fine. I'd love to hear those specifics, read those specifics. Between both the President's budget proposal and the FY18 House Labor bill, more than $2 billion in funding for Title IIA of ESCA, the largest federal funding stream directly supporting teachers and school leaders in 98% of school districts, will be completely eliminated. Completely eliminated. In your role as superintendent and now being president-elect for AASA, how would the elimination of Title IIA funding nationwide affect your abilities to support teachers and implement ESSA?
I would share that the most critical resource that we have in our schools are human resources, and that is especially true of our teachers who touch our students every day. So not having that funding in order to support the professional development that would allow them to continue to ensure that we have the strategies needed to serve our underserved populations as well as all. Also, monies are used in our districts to reduce class size. So again, an increase in class size would be an issue if Title II was eliminated. And certainly what we would find is that it would be very difficult for schools to continue programs like peer mentoring, other things that Title II provides opportunities for us to do without that funding.
So is it fair to say that your organization would strongly support restoration of this funding?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, and thank you for being here with us today. You know, Essa was a significant bipartisan achievement that we initiated to empower state and local education decision-making while attempting to restrain some of the authority of the Secretary of Education, particularly at the local level. Since the law has been enacted, my state of Georgia has been diligently working with over 140 stakeholders to create a state plan. And of course, we call this the bottom-up approach rather than the federal top-down approach. Georgia has gone to great lengths to maximize the flexibility provided by Essa to support its vision of offering a holistic education to each and every child in the state. Of course, I support this vision and our state's commitment to engaging Georgians in this plan development. Of course, I look forward to working with the department in its interpretation of Essa and does not exceed the intent and limits of the law. Our goal here is to achieve every child succeeds. So, Dr. Wright, have you been encountering some of the same problems that Georgia has as far as, you know, bringing stakeholders together and then submitting the plan to the Federal Department of Education and getting pushback?
We have not yet submitted our plan. We're going to be submitting in September, but we've had absolutely no problem gathering stakeholders. There's a lot of people out there that want to have their voice heard around what they consider most important for our children, and so that's been a very exciting and invigorating process, actually, meeting all across the state with our stakeholders.
We have experienced that in Georgia as well, which, like you said, is a very good thing. Mrs. Plechnik, what has your experience been as far as working with the Department of Education, Federal Department of Education?
In terms of the federal department, Arizona.
Trying to get a plan approved. Where are you in that process? And
So Arizona has submitted their plan,
Okay.
so it would be for that submission date of September 2017. We have not yet received feedback on the plan.
you have not. Okay. Do you see, as far as what you're trying to implement, is there any lack of interpretation of exactly what you think the law that we pass says versus what you're trying to accomplish?
I think the Arizona plan reflects the ESSA law, and so we feel confident in our ability then to have that approved and move forward on the implementation.
Okay. Ms. Wright, Dr. Wright, do you, do you feel like that what you're trying to do reflects the law that we passed in every respect?
Absolutely. We've had no difficulty whatsoever with working within the guardrails that are provided, and with as much input as we've had. As I said, we've had over 7,000 pieces of feedback. I meet with the superintendents on a monthly basis, my advisory committee, my teacher advisory committee, the principals advisory committee. We're meeting with those folks on a regular basis and to get their input, but when we come together then to start the formation of the plan, we've not had any difficulty whatsoever in abiding by the guardrails.
Well, that's great to hear, because it's really exciting to see the efforts that are being put forth by the states to make sure that every student succeeds. And I want to thank you and congratulate you on what you're doing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Ms. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of you for being with us today. You know, one of the things that I've been thinking about sitting here that hasn't been addressed so much is just the capacity right now of the Department of Education to work with states, to work with districts in looking at all of these plans. And, you know, so I really inquired about the number of vacancies. And when you look at that, I mean, 12 out of 15 nominees have not even been put forward. Over 70% of senior staff is vacant. Just thinking about which ones those are. The deputy secretary, there's been no nominee put forward for the assistant secretary for civil rights. We have an acting person who's been quite under fire, as you probably know. There's no nominee for the Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education, no nominee for the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development, no nomination for the Assistant Secretary for Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, no nominee for the Assistant Secretary for Career, Technical, and Adult Education, and we've talked about that in the capacity of districts. Ms. Nowicki, as the GAO representative here, how does that capacity affect the ability of states to move forward?
Yes, ma'am. I think, you know, to the degree that there is no political leadership in place in any federal agency, I think that does, you know, certainly play a role in the ability of the very talented and dedicated civil servants in any federal agency, I think, who are respectfully trying to not get out in front of, you know, where an administration may wish to go.
Yeah, I think so, because as you said, they're dedicated, but when you're in limbo, when you're waiting for leadership and direction, that's a difficult thing to do. I don't know, Mr. Lovell, do you want to comment on that as well? How much of a problem is it? Maybe it's not a problem.
Sure. No, I think that it's definitely a problem. When you combine lack of staff capacity with lack of clarity as a result of the rescission of the regulation, it really puts a lot of pressure on the career staff to go through these hundreds and hundreds of pages of material. It's complex. It's dense. I think that there are certainly areas that warrant clarification, such as when a state submits a plan and the question in the template requires a state to define the term consistently underperforming students. And then when a state responds by saying we will identify low-performing students, What does that mean? Without the regulation in place, you don't have a whole lot of guidance to determine what that means or what that doesn't mean, if it's consistent with the law or if it's not. So the department's feedback basically now is serving as that guidance, and states are looking at that really closely to see, well, what rules do I have to follow?
Sure, yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier that when it comes to some of those regulations, looking at whether career and tech, you mentioned that. We also talked earlier about the consistency about higher level thinking skills and where that is placed as well. In addition to that issue, of course, we have the budget issues that have been discussed. And I'm wondering what the impact of deeper cuts to education will have on the ability of states to really serve our most vulnerable students. And one of those areas, we have included a requirement in Essa for 95% of all students in each subgroup to participate in annual assessments to ensure that low-performing students are not encouraged to be absent on test day. One particular example. And if we're disaggregating data, that's going to be a very important effort that moves forward for all students. How are states implementing this policy, and how is the Department of Education going to oversee that, given the situation they have?
So you've raised two issues, one around funding and one around the 95% test participation requirement, and let me address those both. So on the funding, I want to go back to actually a comment raised by Mr. Barletti. He asked about how states are being able to leverage Title I and Title IV dollars for after-school programs. Specifically with regard to Title IV, it's pretty hard to leverage something that doesn't exist. Title IV has been so woefully underfunded that it's questionable how those dollars are going to be able to be used. The authorized level was $1.6 billion. Last year, $400 million was provided. That's less than a third of the authorized amount. So being able to use those dollars for things like after-school programs is a real problem. The 95% participation rate is also a real problem. One place where the department has not been inconsistent is in consistently not mentioning the 95% test participation requirement. There are a number of states that either simply say we are not going to abide by this part of the law, or have very little of an explanation as to how they're going to, and mum's been the word on the 95% test participation requirement.
Any other comments that you all would like to make to those questions? I know we don't have any time left, hardly. I think, this is really an important hearing, and I think when we look back a few years from now to sort of see how did it go, how was it implemented, I think what you've provided today, all of you, has been helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Mr. Mitchell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Upon the passage of Essa, the Wall Street Journal noted, and this is a quote, that it represented the largest devolution of federal control to the states in a quarter century. Unfortunately, the previous administration apparently did not endorse that bipartisan bill. In fact, the previous chair and the chair in the Senate submitted a letter to the Secretary, 30 pages of concerns and objections to the proposed regulations that frankly were largely ignored. The minority here wishes to relitigate the discussion regarding the CRA and the elimination of the rules that were put forth by the previous administration. Let me give you some areas of concerns. The 95% that you referenced, however, the final rule referenced only 4 options and requires schools to implement a plan to address those. There's a whole series of things the department did that overreached the intent of this Congress or the previous Congress and this committee. I wasn't here at the time, but frankly voted in favor of the CRA because I'm offended by the fact that a bill was put forward by this House and the Senate that the administration decided didn't meet their expectations, so they do as they wanted. That's not the way this government works. So rather than spend quality time, frankly, whining about the CRA, we ought to get on and talk about effectively addressing the needs of students in education. Question for you, Dr. Wright, if we could, please. Could you describe some of your means by which you attained what you consider to be quality stakeholder engagement?
We scheduled meetings around the state, and we scheduled them at 2 different times. We scheduled a total of 15 initially, but that does not count all the other specific stakeholder groups that we met with. These were regional meetings. We scheduled our first one typically in the afternoon, somewhere around 3 o'clock, so that those people that were available could be there. But we scheduled the second one in that same area, typically starting at 6 or 6:30, so that we could ensure that our parents that were working would have an opportunity to get there after they got off work. So we made sure that we tried to cover all areas of the state, and also in reaching out, our ESSA advisory group is one that has a diverse group of individuals on it. We met with them on a regular basis. As I've mentioned to you before, I've got a superintendent's advisory committee that I meet with on a monthly basis. I meet with my teachers every other month. And so it gave us an opportunity to really hear from a lot of people.
Thank you. Dr. Pletnick as well, most important stakeholder, we call them stakeholders here, they're parents. Let's be honest about it. What did you do to make sure that we got effective parental engagement in this process? They felt that they had, they were heard.
In Arizona, there were a number of committees and subgroups that were established, and they would have representatives from all stakeholder groups. So certainly our parents are important, our business partners are important. All of those people were represented on the various committees. And in addition, we did have a survey, and anyone could provide feedback, for instance, on our measures of success, those indicators that we were including. There were also, again, meetings that were held across the state, a number of meetings, where people could come and engage, ask questions, get clarification, and provide feedback.
What percentage of your parents responded to the survey, approximately?
I honestly do not have those numbers with me, but I know it was open and there was good participation in it. I do not have exact.
Well, I'm sure it's open. I wasn't questioning that. My concern is that we do everything we can to maximize the engagement of parents and how this is structured, engage them in the educational process so they have every reason to participate with their children. So that's critical, and I would ask Ms. Nowicki if we can make sure as we look at, I know you have nothing to do with the operation, but going forward in terms of the effectiveness, they would look at the effectiveness of engaging not only all stakeholders, teacher groups, those types of things, but parents in the process prospectively and after it's underway. Can we assure that's going to happen?
We would be happy to work with the committee on any requests that they wish to submit, having us look at stakeholder and parent involvement, absolutely.
Madam Chair, I'd ask that we at least consider that as we go forward in assessing the effectiveness of that so that we ensure look at the effectiveness of engagement.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell.
Last question for you, if we could, I guess, is that would be about the last stage of Essa is identify and assist school districts that are low performers. Michigan has some legendary low-performing school districts, unfortunately. A variety of things have been done to try to address that. My question for you would be also, Ms. Nowicki, is there a process by which we're going to assess the effectiveness? Have you identified one, whether the plans are effective at addressing low-performing school districts?
Yes, sir. I think when we have an opportunity to see the monitoring protocols that the department eventually develops, that is one of the things that we would be interested in looking at how they're approaching that.
I'd be curious if the other two educational witnesses, Dr. Pletnick and Dr. Wright, if we get any feedback in terms of how you're going to monitor that, because it seems to be a plaguing problem in some states, clearly is in Michigan, and we need to not only talk about how we're assessing them, but how we're supporting them, and are we getting improvements, or are we just spinning our wheels and students are being lost?
Well, actually, it's one of the goals in our strategic plan that all schools and all districts will be rated C or higher. And so our focus to do that, we have an A through F system, was to identify the lowest performing schools. We're going to be using subgroup data to do that. We've also got a protocol in place that we have required all of our low performing schools to come in for a personal interview, which includes their board members, their principals, et cetera, and then go through the protocol with them about what we're going to be monitoring and how frequently. The bottom line for me as a state superintendent is, are student outcomes improving?
That's right.
And that's where we're coming from.
Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Dr. Pletnick, if you could respond to Mr. Mitchell in writing, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Grijalva, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Pletnick, and welcome, and I'm glad you're here. I'm going to ask some questions about some mitigating factors in terms of how the state plan is approved, when it's approved, and the implementation of Essa in Arizona in the public school districts. Mitigating plans points being, Arizona, along with Mississippi, are ranked the 5 lowest states in terms of per pupil expenditures to the public schools. Arizona, about $3,300 under the national average. So that lack of state support in terms of public instruction is a constant in Arizona. It's been litigated, it's been referendum, it continues to happen yearly at the state level. But now, let me ask, so that's a constant. And you couple that with the cuts that are being proposed in the education budget, and that's an additional layer of lack of support upon the public schools in Arizona and across the country. But then you have also the threat of public funds going to private school vouchers, for-profit charter schools. They're very real now, given President Trump and Secretary DeVos's singular focus on that concept. Under the repealed regulation, charter schools are going to be held accountable through an authorizer reporting. Now, without that regulation that's been repealed, they'll be even less accountable because of that. And the proliferation of for-profit charter schools in Arizona, charter schools in general, don't you think that that regulatory requirement will help to improve the transparency of the state's charter sector? Doctor?
So what I would say is I truly do believe in accountability. So I do believe if any school system receives federal or state funding that they should be held to the same accountability as every other, because I think that is about transparency.
And, I also mentioned the Affordable Care Act. $26 million goes to the state of Arizona for Medicaid to work with children with disabilities. That's $26 million that if the repeal scenario is what we're talking about now, then that would be, again, another layer of non-support that would not be there, particularly for disabled kids. During the discussion, I'm assuming that the discussion of a national voucher tax credit proposal, probably using a tax reform vehicle probably, that is modeled after state programs like the one we have in Arizona. Do you feel that Arizona's voucher program is indeed helping students? And would you recommend as a national policy that we model a national policy after Arizona's voucher program?
I am here at the invitation of Chairperson Fox to speak on Essa implementation, and so I am not as prepared for this hearing to speak to that. Certainly, I could provide additional information regarding it, but there is certainly an impact when we have expansion of those programs, and we know that at the state level.
And if it's public money that's being diverted to those programs, as a consequence, it's another layer of non-support upon the public schools in Arizona.
There is an impact.
So we have those mitigating factors. Where is the state plan at this point? Waiting for review? What's the story on that?
Yes, it was submitted, so that it was submitted, I believe, in May, which would make it for that deadline in September for review.
And you heard the complaints, I'm sure, of many parents, stakeholders, educational groups, relative to the fact that the access and the lack of real dialogue in terms of what that plan was going to be, that was, I think, essentially run out of the governor's office, that there was some opposition and discomfort with the way the plan was put together, correct?
So again, I think that there are components in the plan, as I had shared. I do not think that it is a perfect plan, so I believe there needs to be continued dialogue as we look at what we need to do to continue to drive improvement, especially for our underserved populations in Arizona.
And thank you very much. I appreciate that. But without resources, asking public school systems to meet any benchmark, and you see a eroding support at the state level, at the national level, and at all levels for our public schools, I think you're putting not only the school system in a bad place, you're putting parents in a bad place, and you're jeopardizing a lot of children. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Smucker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Wright, in your testimony, you mentioned the opportunities to expand career and technical education into the classrooms of our elementary and secondary students. And I know there's been some discussion about this. I apologize if it's a duplicate question, but it's a top priority of this committee and a top priority of mine as well. Pennsylvania is working on developing their own state plan in response to Essa, and just wonder what ideas you may have for Pennsylvania and other states to integrate career and technical education into those plans.
Well, that's one thing that we've been very proud of, is working with our businesses around the state. We serve on the state's Workforce Investment Board, and I think having a seat at the table, I think, has a very powerful reality for us. We then separated the state into the local workforce boards and have been working directly with them. They have been very receptive to our work. We're intending to create, as I said earlier, those CTE plans in high school, but we're also looking to see how early we can start some of these plans in middle school, because I think some of our children, we realize that not everybody wants to go to college, but everybody deserves the right to have a wonderful job as soon as they walk across our stage. And so our job is to ensure that all of our children are career and college ready. We are also redoing our diploma options, to be honest with you. We've got one that's going to have a CTE endorsement, and that's going to be a nationally recognized endorsement that children will be able to go right to work if that's what they so choose. But I think the key for us is the developing our economy, and that the way to do that is to ensure that we've got a strong workforce out there that can do that, and the children that are in our classrooms are the ones that we're going to be depending on. So we've got to ensure that they've got the academic skills to do that, but they also have to have the career and technical skills to do that as well.
You mentioned a national endorsement? What is
Yeah, we're looking at the number of national endorsements that students can have, certifications that they can have. We've got a large number of different manufacturing companies. Toyota has a big presence, Nissan has a big presence, Ingalls Shipbuilding has a big presence, the Stennis Space Center has a big presence. So we've got a huge medical area as well as some of the smaller businesses that are looking for people to come to their employment. As I said earlier, about 65% of the jobs that are available are children that are going to need middle schools.
So that certification or endorsement would be part of their diploma as well?
Yes. Okay. Yes, sir.
Interesting idea. Next question. This would be for both Dr. Wright and Dr. Pletnick. Yesterday, I had the honor of welcoming Chairwoman Fox to my district, and we had a roundtable discussion with education leaders from across the district and industry stakeholders as well. And a topic came up that I've heard a lot about. I was in the state senate in my state and chair of the education committee. I'm just curious what your states are doing in regards to standardized testing. Superintendents who were there and who I've heard from the past few years have felt there's been sort of an undue or too much emphasis, I guess, on having all students achieve a certain standard, as opposed to, I think today we have technology or we have education available to provide more individualized learning to meet a student exactly where they are and help all students achieve to their full potential. So I guess I'm curious how both of your states are responding to that.
Well, in Mississippi, we have established and adopted a set of very rigorous standards, pre-K through grade 12. And I think we owe it to our parents in our community to be very transparent about what our children should know and be able to do by the time they leave 12th grade. It's going to be, they depend on us each and every day to ensure that their children are getting what they deserve. And so I feel very strongly that you've got to have a strong set of standards in place that are going to enable children to be successful when they leave us. And so that's the approach that we have, and that's the approach that we're sticking to.
Dr. Platnick, could you respond?
So in Arizona, we do have what's called the Arizona Merit, and that is aligned to our standards. Our standards, too, are very rigorous. But as a superintendent, I also believe that there are many other skills and dispositions that we have to ensure students have before they leave us if they're to be future ready. I think about the fact that I really didn't have to think about coding when I was in elementary, yet that is a skill that is a future-ready skill. When we talk about the 4 C's, communication and critical thinking, all of those things. So I think there have to be multiple measures, and that's what we've worked towards in Arizona in terms of our CC&R indicators. So one test can give us some feedback, but we need multiple indicators to get the true picture of student success and school success.
Thank you.
Mr. Smucker. Ms. Blunt-Rochester, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and also Ranking Member Scott, and also thank you to the panel. I was really pleased to hear that our chairwoman has invited Secretary DeVos to our committee. Education and Essa implementation is probably one of the things that I've heard most from Delawareans, whether it is the champions in civil rights that I talk to, those people who are interested in lifting people out of poverty, to the corporations in my state, which we have many, and all of the small businesses. This is probably one of the top issues. And so my question, I first want to start with Ms. Pletnick. You stated in your testimony that, quote, consistency in how Essa is interpreted and regulated is critical. Uncertainty created by shifting interpretations of the Essa Law continues to be a concern. Given that there's currently no regulatory scheme for Essa interpretation, what position do you think that this puts states in developing and implementing their plans?
So I believe in whether we're talking at the federal level, we're talking at the state level, again, it's important to have that consistent feedback because then in turn, we can move on with the implementation of Essa and make certain that we are directing all our efforts to that implementation and checking those outcomes. So it's critical as we move forward that we make certain that we know exactly what our targets are, that we can get to work and get the work done. So my concern is really about consistency across the board at all levels.
The board. I want to follow that up. And Mr. Lovell, if you could also join in, what impact would the lack of regulation have on underserved populations?
That is a monumentally important question. The concern is that the lack of the regulation will result in too few children being identified and then receiving the support that they need to succeed. We want to make sure that states, when they're proposing to identify students for additional support, that while we want to use all the indicators in the system to support them, we want to make sure that kids don't have to fail on everything before they're actually identified. I think that's a major concern, considering that a few states have been very clear that they want to look at are kids performing on grade level, and if they're not, then let's do something about that. The department's pushed back on that a little bit, and that's very unfortunate because, frankly, if students are not performing at grade level or if they're not graduating, I don't need to know much else to know that something needs to happen. I need to know a lot more to know what to do about it, but I don't need to know a lot more to know that there's a problem. And then back to your again, a question around the regulations. The role of the regulations is to provide a lot of clarification. And there was a comment earlier around the 95% requirement and whether the regulation being overly prescriptive. 4 options were presented. One of those options in the regulation around the 95% was essentially states choose your own adventure. Come up with your own option. So to say that it was only 4 options is actually not entirely the case. And as a result, we have states, when it comes to how are they going to be implementing this very important provision of the law, either not being clear about it or not doing it at all.
I really want to touch a little bit on both regulation and also on capacity. We were talking about undersecretaries and the positions not being filled. I had the opportunity in Delaware to serve as Deputy Secretary of Health and Social Services. And while I was also Secretary of Labor, and secretaries do have an important role, they're external, they're visionary and all of that, but a lot of the detail gets done at that undersecretary level. A lot of the administrative things, a lot of the, there's so much importance also to that level. And so my concern about filling positions is, I share Ms. Davis's concern. Also about regulations, I guess having come from state government, I believe there's a place for regulations. Can we over-regulate things? Yes. But there is a real place, and I think what we're hearing from all of your testimony across the board is consistency, clarity. That helps people to be able to do their jobs better. It helps us to be able to get better outcomes. So I have no more questions. I'm just going to yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I guess I'll ask a question. I guess either Dr. Pletnick or Dr. Wright would be best able to answer it. Could you first of all just give us a general overview? I mean, we wanted to get around, we passed the Student Success Act, get around this top-down approach to how you run your schools. Do you feel we've succeeded in that? Are you happy with that, or would you like further things done along those lines? We'll start with Dr. Pletnick.
As I had shared earlier, I think there are still some things, even at our state level, that were legislation that was tied more closely to the No Child Left Behind era than to what currently is in place with Essa Law. So I think there's still room for improvement, and we need to work on that. Teacher evaluation is an example of that, some other pieces. So yes, Essa has provided us with some of that autonomy and flexibility, but at the state level, I think we still have some things that we'll need to do.
Okay. Are you satisfied with what you're getting out of Washington, though?
Yes. Again, I will tell you that we have submitted our plan. We have not gotten any feedback on that plan at this point.
Okay, same question for you, Dr. Wright.
Yeah, I think the state's role, at least in Mississippi, is setting the long-term goals per subgroup area, so that we know what we want for our children 10 years out. But I think it's really the local districts that and the local schools that need to be developing their own respective plans on how they meet the needs of their individual children. I wouldn't presume to know, I've got 144 districts, all the needs of that. So I trust my superintendents and the principals and the teachers at that school.
You're satisfied with Student Success Act, though? When we say
Yes.
we were pushing things out,
Yes,
you
I am,
were
very much so.
satisfied. Okay, a little while ago, you kind of were talking very positively about kind of more preschool. Have you ever read anything indicating that preschool is not necessarily much of a benefit?
No, quite to the contrary. Preschool, there's too much research out there now for us to not be paying attention to our 3- and 4-year-olds. Quite honestly, we're going to be starting to look to how can we start helping children, birth through grade 3. I think that that's been one of the things that we've been pushing out across our district is the amount of research that's being conducted recently and the long-term effects even in Mississippi that we can verify by research that's been done by Mississippi State on Mississippi children.
Okay. You've never read anything to the contrary to that? Never read anything?
Long time ago, but not within the past, I would say, 5 years, not to my knowledge.
Okay. Next question. One of the metrics that's supposed to show a quality school, well, I'll go to this one. What is an underserved population? Mr. Lovell just used that as a phrase, but could anybody describe what you consider an underserved population?
Well, the law stipulates that states are supposed to disaggregate data for accountability and reporting purposes for major racial and ethnic groups, for English learners, for low-income students, and for students with disabilities. So those are the categories of students that, generally speaking, when we speak to underserved populations, that we're referring to.
Does underserved mean lack of money? Does it just mean poor outcomes?
Well, it often refers really to both. When you look at schools that predominantly serve those populations of students.
Sometimes in Wisconsin, some of the most underperforming districts have the most money, and that's why I wondered what you meant by underserved.
Well, so I think that we would present data that would suggest otherwise.
Nationwide or?
Oh, sure, across the country.
Okay. Okay. If Final question. Sometimes one metric used to measure a quality school district is graduation rates. I know graduation rates are overall up. On the other hand, a lot of times you hear from employers today, people who teach in secondary education, that they feel the kids aren't doing as well or as prepared as they used to be. Could you comment, Ms. Nowicki, on the contradiction there? Is it possible we're lowering the standards on what it takes to graduate, or how can graduation grades be up, but employers and people in secondary education sometimes feel the kids graduating aren't doing as well?
GAO has not done any recent work around graduation rates, so I can't comment from that perspective. I know that the Department of Education's IG has done some work looking at graduation rate statistics and what they mean and don't mean in particular states.
So our organization has looked at this, and actually we're going to be releasing a report in the next few weeks, because that contradiction definitely exists. And states in their ESSA plans have the opportunity to address this by including items in their accountability system that prioritize not just that you get a diploma, but that you get a diploma that really represents that you know something. And to your questions earlier on early childhood, while I haven't seen anything that shows that early childhood is ineffective or isn't necessary, I have read research that shows that early childhood on its own is insufficient. So in other words, early childhood is not an inoculation. You have to continue to invest and support kids throughout their development.
Right. I would hope Dr. Wright would Google early childhood education and criticism, and she'll have no problem finding other things.
Thank you,
Thanks
Mr.
much.
Grossman. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott, for convening this hearing, and thank you to those of you who testified today. I want to reemphasize one of the main points that Mr. Lovell mentioned in his testimony, that ESSA is at heart a civil rights law. The federal government has an important role to play in ensuring equity in education for our children, and while states have wide discretion and flexibility to determine how success is measured, the federal government sets the standard for success. So it's especially true in historically underprivileged groups. So, Mr. Lovell, states have the discretion to create and define the metric used for consistent underperformance. In your analysis of state ESSA plans, how are states defining consistently underperforming? And do you think this equity guardrail in the law is being executed as intended to ensure schools struggling to meet the needs of underserved students are identified and supported to improve?
Thanks very much for your question. I think this is one of the most important provisions in the law. If we're not identifying kids who are continually underperforming, then what are we here for? And if we're not supporting them, then we're certainly not doing our jobs. A number of states have proposed ways to do this that ensure that if a student is not performing at grade level in math or reading, or if there are low graduation rates, those children are identified and something will happen as a result of it. They'll receive some sort of support. Unfortunately, a number of states are also putting together these sort of indexes where you're including a whole bunch of different factors to determine whether a kid is low performing or not. And what we're concerned about is that if you are performing well in one area, that might mask if you're performing less well in another area. And so when you combine all these things together, you come up with not a whole lot that's actually usable. So we want to be sure that states have the flexibility to, as I believe is being proposed in Mississippi, to look at if you're performing at grade level in math or reading. If you're not, then you should be able to receive targeted support. You need to look at each indicator in the system, but you don't have to fail on all of them in order to receive support.
Thank you. Dr. Wright, you mentioned in your testimony that Mississippi is including student subgroup performance and identifying schools for support and improvement. And I know that your plan is only in draft form, but how's Mississippi planning to measure subgroup performance and factor subgroup performance into the school's rating?
So we have the data that we collect on our statewide assessment that we have just redone, grades 3 through 8, and then once again in high school. Those data will be disaggregated by subgroup and then monitored at not only at the state level, but at the district level and at the school level. So we will be able to track that data over time to determine whether or not those subgroups of children are continuing to underperform or are making progress.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A wiser man than me said, probably 35 years ago, the 9 most frightening words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I might amend that to 10 words and submit that I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. Are pretty frightening in their own right. ESEA is a 50-year-old precursor to Essa. It arose during the Johnson administration along with the war on poverty, and we've seen as federal dollars spent on local education rose, a reverse correlation in the performance of United States students versus students across the globe. And candidly, from a state where we rank anywhere between 4th and 6th as it relates to educational outcomes of the 50 states on a regular basis, I wonder why we're competing against 49 other states as opposed to a world of other nations, because that's the playing field upon which our children will ultimately compete. It's often said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I've seen all too often people attack aspirants to serve in political capacities based on what program they supported or didn't support. If you don't support this, you don't care. If you don't support this, you don't like children. If you don't support this, you're not interested in finding solutions to poverty and expanding opportunity. It's all horse feathers. What we need to be focused on as opposed to intentions is outcomes, results, what happens. And I'll tell you, speaking with frustration that vents back to 6, 7 years ago as I was serving in the state legislature, where we identify failing schools and leave students in these failing schools without an option for the parents who lack the socioeconomic and financial wherewithal to vote with their feet, we doom those children to inferior outcomes and inferior educational opportunity. If you ask me whether I believe in nature or nurture, I will tell you I believe in nurture every single time, and that the color of a young person's skin or the job of their parents isn't so much a precursor on their success as to what they're exposed to. But we run into the institutional educational monopoly all the time as we try to create escape hatches for students in places like the whopping five schools that we had the courage to identify as failing in Virginia, to find a way out for these young people who have just as much fundamental entitlement to the single birthright of Americanship, and that is opportunity, as every other kid. I'm sick of watching kids fail based on their zip code. But Jefferson said wisely, and I'll paraphrase, the government closest to home is most effective, most accountable, and governs best. My colleague from Oregon stated that she thinks the solution to our educational problems has to be at the federal level, and then in the same paragraph lamented that Essa prevented Oregon from including particular standards that she felt might help best affect good outcomes for students in Oregon. Dr. Pletnick, do smart people work with you?
I have very intelligent people.
And they're professional and trained people?
Yes, they are.
And they care. They care about the children in the district that you serve?
They do.
And you're the superintendent, correct?
I am.
How many students does your district have?
Approximately 25,000.
And can you name one or two of those kids who might have special needs you're trying to overcome their challenges yourself?
I could, but I will not.
I'm not asking you to, but you could. Yeah, right, but nobody in this room could, right? You could, and you care, and you have smart people, and we don't have a monopoly on good ideas. And you want what? What's best for the outcomes for the students that you serve, is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. Ms. Nowicki, you're familiar with United States student ranks versus their global peers as it relates to academic performance in readings like math and science? Are you familiar with the historical data?
Not specifically.
Okay. Are you familiar with how we were doing, say, 1950, 1960, 1970 versus 1990, 2000, 2010 versus our global peers?
Are you talking about the PISA ratings?
In surveys of outcomes educationally. I would submit, by way of brevity, because I have 1 minute and 9 seconds, that as we've spent more, we've actually gone down versus the competition. Now, I'm not arguing against spending more. Let me be clear. We need to spend money on education. But I got an idea that folks in a county in Arizona and the state of Mississippi know better what's needed. Dr. Wright, we talked about CTE. Is it good in CTE to align the training that we give students with the needs of the job providers in the communities?
Absolutely.
Okay, and who knows better the needs of the job providers in Tupelo or Biloxi, the people in Tupelo or Biloxi, the people in Jackson, or the people in Washington, D.C.?
People in Tupelo and Biloxi.
Correct, thank you. I mean, I'm a little biased here. And so I guess what I'm driving at here is that this is great. I think this is a step in the right direction. It doesn't have, like anything from Washington, it has warts and pimples, but you are good, smart people who give a damn, pardon me, about the outcomes for the children in your communities. And the way we arrive at the best solutions is by letting loose 50 laboratories for democracy and finding out what works. And our role, since we've already co-opted so much of the resources at the federal level, should be to power those down to states and localities. Would you agree to let you all do what you think works best and then let others fall in on the plans that succeed? Thank you. That's rhetorical. I'm out of time.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Hey, I was only 12 seconds over, Madam Chair. That's a new record.
Mr. DeSagne, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for having this hearing. Mr. Lovell, I'm always taken when I look at the achievement gap by a comment I heard by Stanford researcher Linda Darling some years ago, well, it wasn't that long ago, a few years ago, that if we had just continued to do what we knew was the right things to invest in 30 years ago, for the past 30 years, we wouldn't have an achievement gap. So when we look at the difficulties in people, whether they're in Mississippi or in Concord, California, where I'm from, in the achievement gap, could you talk to that a little bit about where accountability comes, that yes, we want local jurisdictions to decide, but on the other hand, there's a benefit to this research that applies across all 50 counties, and the federal government affording that to local communities so they can be informed on what's happening around the country and why it's important for consistency that there is some accountability there.
No, thank you very much for the question. I think that that Chairwoman Fox said it very well at the beginning of this hearing when saying that ESSA provides a balance between accountability and autonomy. And the reality is that everyone needs to have a role in this, and there is a federal role to be played. ESSA is a civil rights law, and what ESSA does is provide a broad framework for the accountability and ensures that those kids who have the least have a shot of success. So it's also needs, I think, to be well understood that we have seen improvements in educational outcomes over the last decade. Look at graduation rates as an example. Back in 2000, 2001, if you were to draw a line between the graduation rate in 2000 and 2007-8, basically you've got a straight line. But then in 2008, something happened. The U.S. Department of Education, under President George W. Bush, issued a regulation around graduation rate accountability because apples, and we're not being compared to apples across states. If you compare to graduation rate calculations, one state was using one calculation, another state was using another. After the federal government issued the regulation in 2008, you saw something pretty remarkable happen. Graduation rates started increasing. As a result, since 2000, 2.8 million more kids have graduated. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for them, and it's a big deal for the nation's economy, considering that by 2020, 2/3 of jobs are going to require at least some post-secondary education, and a high school diploma is the first step to getting there.
And the second part of my questions are coming from the Bay Area, and I appreciate the fact that we had really robust field hearings that the chairwoman and the ranking member were part of, and I was lucky enough to be part of those, but particularly as you will remember, Madam Chair, the last part of that field hearing at Stanford University, the Harvard of the West Coast, I might add, to the ranking member. I get this all the time in the Bay Area, is from tech people. We have our challenges on housing and transportation, but the thing that comes up all the time from employers is we need to provide a workforce for a global economy that's changing at warp speed. So accountability is a big part in the business sector, and again, a lot of these companies will move. I don't want them to move from the Bay Area, but they are. But one of the things that determines where they're moving are things like housing costs, but it's also the education system. So while it's important, I think, and I very much support local control and what, Dr. Wright, you have said, there are things that in this economy require, I think, the federal government and the business community to inform us at a local level, this is what we're looking for and this is what we have to invest in. So let any of you respond to that. And I think the urgency to that is really the predominant thing for me, is how do we maintain our preeminence in innovation in this country? And I'll say specifically for Northern California, the answer to that is investing in not just in education, but doing it smartly, but doing it in a way that's informed, given how quickly the workforce is changing and the demands on that workforce. So, Mr. Lovell, if you could start any of the other
No, I'd be happy to. You know, the Essa asserts that when there's low-performing schools or low-performing students, something has to happen. It doesn't prescribe what happens, and there's the balance. The federal government ensures that we are taking care of our lowest-performing kids and leaves it to states and to districts and to schools and to my colleagues to my right and my left as to how to do that best. Because the federal government can't do that. But what the federal government can do is ensure that we're all playing by the same rules. I'd also say that that we see a lot of really effective innovation taking place at the local level, and I'd pick on California in a positive way in this regard. CTEs come up on a number of occasions, and in California, through the Linked Learning Initiative, there's a lot of really great work going on to integrate rigorous academics with CTE. And there's an important federal role to play, and this committee has played that role by reauthorizing the Carl Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. So there's a role for everyone to play, but I appreciate you raising this need to really acknowledge that the federal role here is important. It doesn't displace the local role, but it's two different roles. One is to ensure that our lowest performing kids are being supported when they need it, and then the state and local role is to actually implement that.
Thank you, Mr. Lovell. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. DeSagne. Mr. Scott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Nowotny, did the GAO conduct a compliance review on plan components or policy decisions made by states like Ohio or California? Or did the GAO make any value judgments concerning the plan development, or did you just make an observation of those plans?
It was just an observation of those plans, sir. We did not make a compliance judgment.
Thank you. And we heard complaints from some representatives of civil rights groups that flexibility could result in an abuse of really equity compliance. Your plan didn't comment on equity, as I understand it. Did you contact representatives of parents, state-level advocates, advocates of children with disabilities, or civil rights groups?
Generally not for this work, sir. We were primarily engaged with national stakeholder groups who were working with states.
Thank you. Mr. Lovell, the whole point of ESEA and Aasa is to eliminate achievement gaps, providing equal educational opportunities. Can you've kind of gone around this, but can you show how subgroups so far have addressed equity?
How states have addressed that, equity?
With their, with
their subgroup accountability? No, thank you for the question. So there's a spectrum, right? So you've got some states that, as I've said, are looking at, are students performing at grade level? And if they are, let's do something about it. You have some states that, that will be looking at a whole bunch of different indicators, and as I've said, I fear that in doing that, what we'll be doing is providing the chance for low achievement to be masked by higher achievement. So if you say, so actually to the conversation that was taking place earlier around graduation rates, you can have a high graduation rate, which means that kids are actually getting a diploma, but they may not be reading or doing math at grade level, right? If you combine those two things together, then you're not getting the right read on what's happening in the school. Another thing that I fear is happening as a result, with regard to the role of subgroups in these plans, is that when states have report cards, so if your school gets an A, B, C, D, F, they're not adequately incorporating the performance of each group within their grades. So you can have a high letter grade, but you can have low performance for historically underserved kids.
And if you have a subgroup that's not doing well in the school system, what support do members of those subgroups get in schools that are otherwise doing well?
Well, it's really up to the states, the districts, and the schools to determine that. The law stipulates that they're to receive evidence-based intervention, but the schools, the districts, and the states will determine what those interventions are.
And, well, how is that a credible plan? Who decides whether there is a credible strategy to address the achievement gaps?
Well, that's a great question. The template that is distributed by the Department of Education on the questions around school improvement, there really aren't a lot of questions, and so what's really going to be happening is fairly unclear.
Why is the 95% testing rule important?
For a few reasons. One, we have to have accurate data, and two, we want to make sure that low-performing kids are not intentionally or unintentionally encouraged to not be present on test day.
And what happens if you don't get 95% tested? What happens to the data?
Well, the data becomes unreliable.
Dr. Wright, you indicated that your credentials are nationally recognized. What's wrong with credentials that are not nationally recognized?
There may be some CTE, I assume you're referring to the CTE programs. I think some of our local businesses, those CTE programs are going to be developed specifically for them, so they may not be a national credential. Having the CTE endorsement on the diploma is a student's option, and so they can either go for the traditional diploma or to go for a CTE endorsement on their diploma. That is their option, but the local businesses may not have a national certification, but they will have a certification that will allow them to assume a job in the local business.
But what's the value of the national certification?
They can go anywhere in the United States. I mean, I think that's the power of having national certification, is that children are mobile and families are mobile, so this will allow them to really look around the nation to see where their certification could earn them, say, the most money, or where their family wants to move to.
And if I could provide an example of this really quickly, there's the National Academy Foundation. Students that participate in a NAF Academy, and they get the NAF track certification. They're graduating from high school with their diploma. They get the NAF track certification, and 13 companies and big companies like AT&T, Cisco, JP Morgan Chase, give those students preferential hiring treatment when they're done with post-secondary education. So there are ways that we can really incentivize the integration of CTE in academics and make sure that when kids are graduating, they're graduating with something that'll help them down the road.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. It's now my turn to ask questions of the panels. Dr. Wright, you talk about Mississippi, how Mississippi State Plan is related to the State Board's strategic plan in Mississippi. And we hope that ESSA allows you the flexibility to integrate the plan you're developing under ESSA with the work the state is already doing. Do you and your department, the State Board, and other stakeholders around the state see that integration as possible and desirable, or is your ESSA work something that's happening separate from the other reform work going on in the state?
That's a great question, and we look at it as very much integrated. We feel very strongly that our state strategic plan is a strong one, and we looked at ESSA as a way to strengthen that plan and refine that plan and give us the opportunity to add other components that we may not have had in that. But that's been our message right from the very beginning.
Dr. Pletnick, could you respond to that same question in terms of what's happening in Arizona?
As a matter of fact, there was an effort, again, to establish goals at our state level, and I had the privilege of serving on the long-term goal committee that established the goals as part of ESSA, and we were certain to align those goals to make certain that what the state had developed was also reflected in the state plan when the state board, when the agency submitted those.
Great, thank you. Dr. Wright, we've heard criticisms which continue throughout the process for what became ESSA, that states can't be trusted to hold schools accountable and intervene in low-performing schools. And certainly Mr. Garrett touched on this in his comments. You talked about school improvement being an important element in the plan that Mississippi is developing. Obviously, this is something that states and districts must do and should do, but ESSA largely puts the actual strategies back in your hands. Could you tell us more about how your state and school districts are thinking about improving low-performing schools under ESSA?
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, that is our goal 6 of our strategic plan around ensuring that our districts and our schools are rated C or higher. I feel very strongly that everybody needs to be held accountable, and that starts with me, my team, and I think we owe it to our parents to ensure that we are looking out for all children across the state, regardless of zip code, as someone mentioned earlier. We are putting together protocols for our low-performing schools to follow, and as I mentioned earlier, we've even got a totally different process that we're using about having them coming in and justify even their spending, and to ensure that they do have evidence-based interventions that they're spending their money on, and not just interventions that do not have any evidence of working. And so that is going to be something that we're doing on an ongoing basis. I feel very strongly that the children of our state deserve nothing less than the best, and we have to ensure as a state that we're monitoring that very closely, because our children, not only our children depend on it, but our parents depend on it, and they trust us to make sure that that happens.
Thank you. Another question, Dr. Wright.
Sure.
Dr. Pletnick has talked about how she applauds the planning approach in Arizona, even though she doesn't agree with everything in the plan. And you've talked about the stakeholders you've engaged with and how your state plan reflects the view of these stakeholders. And by the way, it's an impressive process that you talked about. I'm sure that not every stakeholder, though, agrees with everything that's in the draft plan so far. So how have you engaged with critics to at least ensure everyone has the opportunity to be heard?
I think it's really important that everybody's voice is heard. I'm a big believer in advocacy, and I think that anybody that's in front of you that's advocating, they're advocating for a reason. And we've been very forthright about what we can and cannot do. We went through a series of 3 different assessments in 3 different years, and that kind of drove my teachers and superintendents a little crazy. So I said, we're going to hold tight on an accountability system, at least for 3 straight years under the same assessment, so that they did not feel I was continuing to change the target. So when we've got stakeholders coming in and saying, well, we'd love to have a school climate survey embedded into our accountability system, I've said, if you can just press pause, we're putting a task force together now at the end of our 3rd year to take a look at our entire accountability system and say, are there any unintended consequences, or are there other things we can add? So we've acknowledged what they've wanted, but we've also tried to provide a reason why we either can or cannot include that in our plan.
Great. Thank you very much for that. I want to thank all of our witnesses for taking time to testify before the committee today. And even though most of our members have left, I really appreciate members on both sides coming and asking good questions, sometimes pontificating, but participating in what's going on. As everybody has indicated, we have an important subject here. I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Scott for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, we've heard the necessity to get the Department of Education before us to respond to some of the concerns about inconsistencies in terms of responding to the state plans and other priorities by the department, particularly in terms of funding priorities. We've heard the real necessity for having many of the programs within Aasa actually funded, because if we're asking them to get the job done, we've identified technical assistance to teachers, after-school programs, and other things that can be very helpful, and if we don't fund them, it just complicates their life. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, passed in 1965, was designed as a civil rights law to guarantee equal educational opportunities. We've gone through many iterations. The last, of course, is Essa. It has 2 major requirements. One is a requirement that localities assess to ascertain whether or not there are achievement gaps, and where they find achievement gaps, having a meaningful strategy to eliminate those. Dr. Wright has indicated what a meaningful strategy might look like, and I think it's significant that it wasn't just one program in reaction. It's a long-term strategy that starts with early childhood education and following the students to ascertain whether or not the strategy is working, and making sure that you actually address the achievement gap. There's flexibility in, in how to assess, and the strategy to eliminate the achievement gaps. But there's no flexibility on the requirement that the assessment be done and that the accountability doing something about it is credible. And if a state fails to adequately explain how they're going to assess for achievement gaps or fails to outline a credible strategy to address those achievement gaps, it's the responsibility of the Department of Education to intervene. Madam Chair, we have letters from several organizations that I'd like to submit for the record. They're letters from advocacy organizations and stakeholders about their engagement in Essa approval so far. The letters are from the Advocacy Institute, Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the National Down Syndrome Congress.
Without objection.
I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. I have found this to be a very, very interesting hearing today. And I think that a lot of what it boils down to is a subject we deal with a lot in this committee and that I talk about a fair amount, and that is the role of the federal government in education. I think it was very important that both Dr. Wright, Dr. Pletnick brought up the fact that Essa is not your entire educational program in your states. I think that many times people tend to think that what the federal government is providing in terms of funding or what we are providing in terms of law is it, that's all you're doing. And I think we've done a disservice in many cases to the American people in many things that the federal government has done to make it appear as though the federal government is the savior. We have a big program, and all of a sudden everybody thinks it's the answer. I think my own experiences as a member of a board of education tell me a lot about what Mr. Garrett was talking about. My experiences since then in visiting schools all over the country. We have a lot of wonderful teachers, principals, superintendents, custodians who want to provide a great educational experience for the students in their schools. And I think in many cases, the federal government has a very limited role in that. And that for us to always look to the federal government to solve every problem that exists out there is a mistake. And we have to understand the limitations, I think, that we have. I think Essa was a big step forward in giving the flexibility that the locals and the states need to be able to provide that education. My colleague said what we should be about is providing equal educational opportunities, and I certainly believe that. I believe that education is the answer to so many things, so many challenges facing people in this country, from getting out of poverty to finding meaningful work to having a successful life. So I want those opportunities. But I think too many times what we say to the American people is that we can have equality in outcomes. And having taught for 15 years, I know that just isn't going to happen. I was shocked. When I taught, I said to my students, everybody in here can make an A, and I really meant that. And I gave unlimited opportunities to students to do that. But I had a bell-shaped curve every semester. And I was truly shocked by that because I didn't believe, I thought everybody would take every opportunity to make the best grade that he or she could make, and it didn't happen. So I believe in equal educational opportunities, but I don't think we're going to have equal results. And I think we have to temper what we do. But we have to trust people at the local level. And I appreciate very much those people who are out there every day teaching, committing themselves to helping students. And for those of you who are administrators, bless you for what you do. Particularly bless you if you listen to your teachers, you listen to your parents, and you listen to the stakeholders. The other thing that we hear a lot about, and I'm really glad Mr. DeSaulnier brought this up, because it's true, again, on both sides of the aisle. In most cases, we think of education as preparation for the workforce. We don't have many people who can go through an educational system and then not do anything to provide for themselves. And we're all hearing about this. And so I think emphasis on what we're doing out there, whether people end at the secondary level and don't go on for any other formal education, they're going to get educated, whether it's a formal process, is really important. But I think we're moving in the right direction with Essa, and I'm, again, particularly glad to hear our two administrative people talk about how this is one piece of the answer, not all of it, because I think we have to understand the proper role of the federal government. So thank you all very much. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.